thank you for being here, and thank you for the invite. Again, my name is Neil Franklin. I'm a retired major from the Maryland State Police, and I also did 4 years with the Baltimore Police Department as the head of training from 2000 to 2004, and then 6 years with another Maryland police agency, Maryland Transit, where I worked on Homeland Security issues, Chief of Patrol, as well as Chief of Detectives during that time. This is always a very interesting, how do I say this? Every time I speak to someone about this issue, the war on drugs, sometimes it really gets to me emotionally, and you'll see why. But how does someone who has spent 34 years in policing, primarily in the fields of criminal investigation and drug investigation, responsible for not just personally locking up hundreds of people for drug violations? Let me say most of those people I arrested during my time in Maryland was for marijuana possession. Not leading some big organization, not being some kingpin of some major drug operation, but from your possession. So not just personally making those arrests, but I also commanded a number of task forces. I had 7 drug task forces at one time for the western part of our state. And then later on in my career, I had 9 task forces, drug task forces in the eastern part of our state. So now I'm commanding teams of people who are out doing the very same thing that I did when I worked undercover. One of the interesting things that I found is that we were very strategic in the work that we did. Now, when I say that word strategic, you're probably thinking about, okay, so this is how they go about dismantling a drug organization. No, this is how they go about making their community safer. But that's not what I'm talking about. We were very strategic in the communities that we did this work in. Mainly poor, black and brown communities. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Eastern Shore of Maryland, but there's not a lot of black communities on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. But we were able to find them. And that's where we did most of our work by far. So as I'm going through my career and doing this work, you gotta understand something. I truly believe that I was making my communities safer. And I say communities plural, even though I was raised in Baltimore. And during that time I was living just north of Baltimore. But the reason I say communities is because I believe as a police officer, every place that you work is your community. And you need to have relationships, strong relationships, positive relationships with the people that you work with, the people that we protect, the people that we serve. And that word serve is the main word here. So I say communities, plural. In doing this work, in believing that we were making our community safer, every moment, every so often I get this feeling that things weren't quite right? You know, whether it's the community we're targeting, you know, I'm asking myself questions. So what happens with these folks once they're arrested for a minor drug possession charge? You know, some of these people were heads of their households, you know, they had kids, they were moms, you know, so what happens? But you know what, we never, personally as cops, we never followed that, we never tracked that. It got to a point where we never even went to follow up in court to see, many of these cases we never even went to court for. You know, they would plead out, you know, different ways to resolve their cases, but many of them ended up in jail. And yes, people go to jail for marijuana. But as time goes on, you know, things would happen. I eventually, as a lieutenant, became, so in Baltimore, in case you don't know, back in the 1980s, we had a mayor that was, Kurt Schmoke, who was starting to see some things. Problems with how we were going about fighting this war on drugs. Health-related issues as well as violent crime. So he started a needle exchange program with his health commissioner in Maryland, in Baltimore. And I was a lieutenant then with the Maryland State Police, and they needed a uniform law enforcement representative on that board. And I was assigned to that board. exchange program? What? We're going to give people syringes to use heroin? But you see, I worked in this very isolated place called law enforcement, right? So I didn't realize the health implications of intravenous drug users. And I didn't realize the rate of HIV and AIDS. You know, there's a lot I just didn't know. But then I learned. And then I got it and I saw it. And within a matter of years, hepatitis C and HIV in Baltimore went down dramatically because of that. And you know what? We didn't have an increase in heroin users. Okay? That number stayed relatively flat. So that was a kind of like, you know, a little tap on the shoulder. Time goes on. In 2000, I retired from the Maryland State Police and then went to work for Baltimore City. And during that year, a very good friend of mine who was a detective, a narc with the Maryland State Police, Ed Totley, was working undercover with the FBI in Washington, D.C. And he was buying cocaine from a mid-level drug dealer. And in this world of the illicit drug market, there are no rules. There are no regulations, no guidelines on how to go about your business, and it's ruthless. Ed thought he had befriended this guy selling cocaine, and he thought that there was a relationship there. But on this final buy of cocaine, this guy decides that he's going to keep the money, Ed's money, and the cocaine that he was going to sell that. Now, you know, in order to do that, and you wonder, some people wonder why we have so much violence within our communities with the drug trade. And this is an example why. Because when this guy decided to rip off Ed Totley, he knew one thing, that if I don't kill this guy, see, he thought Ed was a drug dealer. He didn't know he was an undercover cop. He says, if I'm going to rip this guy off, I got to kill him. Because if I don't, he's going to come back at me. And that's what we see being played out in our streets and cities all across this country every day. It's the fighting between the gangs and the crews and the retaliation that takes place. So what did he do? He shot Ed at point blank range. And he killed him. That really made me pause. Because it made me think about the violence that's associated with the illegal drug trade, the war on drugs that we're still fighting. And most of us, I do believe that most of us in this country realize that that's a war that can't be won. Not in the way that we're fighting. So it made me really, really pause and think about what was going on. And at this time, as I said, I'm working for the Baltimore Police Department. And a short time later, there was a Baltimore City police officer who was doing a field interview with a known drug dealer on the street corner in Baltimore City. He killed that police officer, Michael Cowder. So here's more violence that I'm seeing against the police officers and friends that I knew. Short time after that, just a matter of months, there was another drug dealer who had just shot at a rival gang member. He was wearing a ballistic vest and he was fleeing from the police in the car. He intentionally broadsides Kayvon Gavin's patrol unit and kills him. 2 years after Ed was killed, then it really got to me. In Baltimore, there was a family, the Dawson family. Mother, father, 5 kids. The mother, Angela, was doing what we want good citizens to do as we fight this failed war on drugs. Work with us. Tell us who's selling the drugs. Where are they in your community? We'll come in and we'll go get them. People, we've been doing that for decades. So she did that. And this drug dealer found out about it. Time to send a message. You don't mess with me, my boys who are selling my drugs. You don't mess with my money. He set their house on fire in the middle of the night and killed the entire family to send a message. What really got my attention in this failed war was the violence that followed. And you know what? Most of the money being made in the illicit drug market, you know what that comes from? It comes from marijuana. Marijuana sales. And so now I'm starting to think, and I'm starting to look at this from another strategic direction of, how do we do away with this? And I start thinking about, gee, we've been here before in this country with alcohol prohibition. I mean, obviously, I don't remember. In the 1920s, I wasn't even thought of. But 13 years in the 1920s, ending in 1933, we dealt with alcohol prohibition. Same thing. If you've yet to read the book, The Last Call, by Daniel Krent, you should read that book. And you'll think that you're reading about today. The murder rate went through the roof during alcohol prohibition and only came down after 1933 when we ended it. Corruption, police corruption, political corruption, high cost of citizens' tax dollars. What about the dangerous booze that was flowing through our streets and people were drinking and getting sick and dying from it? Because there was no quality control measure. There was no regulation in place, right? One huge disaster it was. The people who put it in place after 13 years, they said, what a disaster. They knew what it was like before, and now many of them, along with mothers, and why do I say mothers? I say mothers because kids had been recruited in large numbers by the bootlegging industry, the bootleggers, to work with them, just like today, selling drugs, transporting booze. It was a very dangerous business. Al Capone, Bugsy Siegel. Come on, the term gangster, that's where it comes from. I think you all know that. So they ended it. And they ended it by passing another amendment. You know how difficult it is to pass an amendment? But that's how serious it was for them. So they did that. Did away with alcohol prohibition. Did it solve our alcohol problem of drinking? Of course not. It's a medical issue. It's an issue of education. It's an issue for family, for your doctor, for your church, if you're in church, pastor. But not one for us to criminalize. So we learned that lesson with alcohol prohibition. But here we are again today. As I went forward and started making a lot of these comparisons, I then quickly started to realize some other things. Oh my God, we are the #1 incarcerator on the face of the planet. 5% of the world's population, but yet we have almost 25% of the world's prisoners. How is that even possible in the land of the free? How is it? Well, I'll tell you how it is. You see, prior to the 1970s, when we started the war on drugs, don't get me wrong, marijuana and all these other drugs, they were prohibited way before the 1970s. But what was significant about the 1970s with President Nixon, when he launched the war on drugs, he then made money available for local law enforcement to come into this federal effort, to go after the kingpins, to go after the people who were moving the large quantities of drugs, which we did. We did it in a fierce way. But prior to that, 400,000 people we had in prison across this country. A couple of decades later, we're looking at 2.3 million. It's down a little bit now because we've really been working hard to do something about that, but not nearly enough of what we need to do. So I found, God, we're the #1 incarcerator. We're not a third world country. We're not China. We're not Russia. We just don't put people in prison for anything, or do we? Or do we? I then started learning about overdose deaths. I then started learning about the constitutional violations that were occurring left and right across this country. Unconstitutional searches, civil forfeiture, how we're taking people's property. We're not even charging many people with a crime. That's absurd. What about due process? Isn't this country about due process? At every turn, I was learning something new regarding the problems that the war on drugs was causing. And the cornerstone of it all, I believe, is marijuana. That's another story. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we have a lot of work to do in ending the war on drugs, and I believe the beginning of it, I think it begins with ending marijuana. And we're starting to see some really good things happen. We're starting to see some changes in Colorado and California, Washington State, Oregon, Vermont, the first state where the legislative body moved to end this madness. Our policymakers are finally getting it, right? You know, they're finally getting it and understanding this is the beginning to reducing this overburdened prison population. See, people fail to realize just how much that is costing us with a couple million people in prison. And millions upon millions under the control of parole and probation, under the control of our criminal justice system. In hard numbers, cops, courtrooms, and prisons fighting this failed policy of the war on drugs, $50 billion every year. $50 billion. Just give each state $1 billion. And you know what we could do with that. The indirect cost, we have no idea what it is, but I can tell you this much. When you've got someone in prison, when we're sending our young people to prison in the alarming numbers that we are, and again, yes, we do send people to prison for marijuana. All right? They're arrested, they go to a detention center, and many of them are in jail in many of our cities across this country for a year before even going to trial. Yeah, innocent until proven guilty. Okay. But the indirect cost is mind-boggling. There's no way we can figure it out, but we know it's a whole lot more than $50 billion a year. Because when someone is removed from our community, especially despite what you think about how they're bringing money into the household, okay, and I'm not talking about doing something where you're victimizing, where you're assaulting, where you're hurting someone else. I'm talking about literally a couple of adults entering into a contract to exchange goods. Now, when you put the head of a household into jail, even if it's just for a short time, what happens to the family? What happens to the remaining people, the kids that are in that household? Now, where is the income coming from? There's a lot to this, but I just want you thinking about what happens when we send someone to prison. So think about it from your perspective, what you know, right? What happens, the challenges of that family. Do they go on social services? You know, now getting money from the government. You know, what do the kids do? Okay? Because just because someone is trying to make ends meet by doing something that might be a little illegal, like, you know, it doesn't mean that they're not looking out for their family members and taking care of their kids. But it costs us dearly in a number of different ways. But me, as someone who was working extremely hard in putting people away, in fighting the war on drugs, now I realize just how much damage I was doing to my community, unwittingly. But I was seriously hurting my communities. The work that I do now in speaking about the changes that we need to make and why we need to make these changes, because of what it's doing to our society. I love the policing profession. Yes, I'm retired, but I love the policing profession. I'm still engaged with law enforcement and training and education and some other things. You know, trying to get police officers to see what their job is truly all about. You know, we used to be called peacekeepers at one time, you know? You know, police-community relationships, I believe, that breakdown that we're seeing today, I truly believe that the foundation of that has a lot to do with us fighting the war on drugs, going into communities, and the first thing that comes into our minds is searching someone's pockets, searching someone's car, searching someone's home, instead of asking them about the assault that occurred on them the night before. Instead of properly handling a domestic violence situation or properly dealing with homicides. The energy and time, manpower, brain power that we're wasting on fighting this failed war on drugs, we can't even properly investigate rapes in this country. We have rape kits sitting on shelves because we don't have the time or the money to process them. Pedophiles. I don't know if any of you have ever been a victim of identity theft. The police want nothing to do with investigating identity theft. They don't. We don't have the time. But these are the things that are truly important to people. So, again, I love this profession. And I think that because of fighting the war on drugs, in many respects, we have lost respect of our communities. I want to see us getting back to protecting people from violent people. That's what I want to see. And again, I think by moving in this direction, I think that we have a chance to do that. By moving in this direction to end these failed policies of the war on drugs, we can dramatically reduce our prison populations, get people back to their families, back to work, being productive members of society. I truly believe that our communities will be safer, and you know what? I've got a lot more to say, but when I said that last bit right here of I truly believe our communities would be safer, that's when I started thinking of Sarah Swain. And I think with that, this is a good time to bring you up the new Attorney General for the state of Kansas. So I think you know Sarah Swain, who I've come to know very much, and I want to say something. I've read a lot about Sarah. I know a lot about Sarah, but I finally had some time to really spend with Sarah, and I'm telling you, you guys got a winner here. Now, there's this thing called Google, and you can do your homework. I've had many, many opportunities over the past decade since I've been doing this work because a lot of our elected officials have finally seen the light and are finally doing what Sarah is doing, right? Coming forward to end the madness. I've been doing this for about a decade. I've had many opportunities to speak for champions like Sarah, but I haven't until today. Until today. So you can Google it. I have not done this for anyone in the past decade, but this is how much I think of her and the work that she's doing. And I've just heard so much good stuff about you. I am honored to introduce you, Sarah Swain, the next Attorney General for the state.
Now that was a great introduction and a great talk. Thank you, Neil, for coming to Kansas on his own dime. You know, one thing you learn when you enter the crazy world of politics is that nobody does anything on their own dime for any reason. So the fact that he's here today and he came here because he believes in, because him and I together believe in the same ideas, and those ideas are that you can never move the country country forward. You can't move these policies forward. You can't make change as long as no one's willing to stand up and sort of shine the light in the darkness and educate people and change the narrative. You know, there's an attorney, I believe he's in Alabama, his name's Brian Stevenson, and he wrote a New York Times bestseller called Just Mercy that if you haven't read, you have to buy it immediately and read it. It's amazing. It's about his work with a death row prisoner who was innocent and later exonerated. But Brian Stevenson talks a lot about narratives and about how powerful they are, because we just repeat things into eternity and then it becomes a fact, whether it really is a fact or not. And that's what I think about mass incarceration. Everyone in our country has just accepted the idea that, well, of course we need more cops and more prisons and bigger jails and more judges and more courtrooms, and I just reject all of those ideas. You know, I grew up from a very different perspective from most people in the legal profession. I grew up very poor. As a young woman growing up in poverty, I experienced what it was like to be in the lower class, to be looked down on, to be treated differently. And you know, when you go through those experiences as a child, you can either use those to fuel you in the future, or you can sort of use them to make excuses to yourself about why you really can't achieve very much. And for me, I just happened to have a father at home who was just crazy enough that as we were living in our one-bedroom house with me and my parents and my 5 brothers and sisters, you know, my father was saying, Sarah, of course you can be anything you want to be. What do you, of course you're going to go to college, of course you're going to get your education. What do you want to do? What do you want to be? And somehow I believed that. And then fast forward through the years of making it through college, making it through law school, getting my first job as a public defender, making $38,000 a year, which I was stoked to have, I'm not gonna lie. And my first day on the job, I had never been in a courtroom. I showed up as a public defender, I'm here, day 1, and my boss said, well, here's your 15 felony cases, and you're going to court this afternoon. And I was off and running. And what I found almost immediately about the criminal justice system was that I had gone from being the poor girl sort of at the bottom of the totem pole to really having the power to stand up next to these people in court who didn't have the money to hire an attorney, in many cases didn't have the money to post bond, so any contact that I was having with them was happening at the jail, going and doing jail visits with them. But going into court and seeing that every single time I was in court, I was really impacting people's lives just by being there as someone who is an advocate for them and who was going to fight for them and who was invested in them and who had taken the time to get to know them and what their story was and what was really on the line. It's hard to not go in and fight passionately for someone's bond to be reduced if they have their child's funeral to go to. But what I saw very early on in the process was how And a lot of the things that Neil talked about from his perspective as someone who spent a career in law enforcement, I can talk about from the perspective of being a public defender in Johnson County, which was a very mostly white, affluent suburb. And so the majority of the cases that I saw were black and brown people, car stops, knock and talks, which is where certain hotels or motels are targeted, and police officers just walk up to people's doors and knock on them and do everything they can to barge inside. But like Neil said, it always seemed strange to me that in a county with 90% white people, so many of my clients were people of color. And I would read the police reports and I would see these really made up reasons that the police had come up with for how to have contact with people. And really, truly invasive in ways that if you're someone who has never been pulled over and asked to step out of the car and had 15 minutes of your time taken while a police officer does everything he can to intimidate you, bully you, talk down to you. Who in here has had that happen? You don't count. Anyone else? It's a rare occurrence for white people to talk about those situations. If you're a black person, you're going to have probably not just one example of that having happened to you in your life. You may have a dozen examples of that having happened to you in your life. And so as I started to see, I hadn't gotten to the part of having just a moral objection to the war on drugs, but what I saw was just the very real catastrophic consequences that the war on drugs had to people. Because that's really what the war on drugs is. It's really just a war on mostly poor people and mostly people of color. And that offended me greatly. And so when I came to Lawrence, which is where I had been living at even as I was practicing in Johnson County, and I lived in Lawrence. I moved to Lawrence because of what Lawrence supposedly stands for. We're this liberal bastion in deep red Kansas. This is where the hippies live with the free love, and they like to smoke their weed and be left alone. And when I came to Lawrence, I saw that nothing was different in the way that the war on drugs was being carried out. I saw us going from having a Republican district attorney to electing a Democrat district attorney who was a defense attorney who turned around and instituted policies that continue to ramp up the war on drugs in Lawrence, Kansas. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that in a town where we've moved to try to decriminalize marijuana, there's obviously a great amount of support in the community, and yet going into the courthouse every day, there are district attorneys in Lawrence, Kansas, every single day asking judges to put people in jail or prison for marijuana. That's what I would say. Not just marijuana, but other crimes as well. And if they're not asking them to be put in jail for a crime involving marijuana, they're in the courtroom asking for them to be put back in jail for failing a UA for marijuana while being on probation. A friend of mine who runs the legal services for prisoners says that something like 50% of every parole violation in the state of Kansas is for a dirty urinalysis for marijuana. So it's so interesting, you know, when you start peeling back the layers. When earlier this year, when when we had the county commission attempting to greatly expand our jail. And one of my talking points that I held on to consistently, because I am a criminal defense attorney whose phone rings all day, every day, with people calling, telling me about what's happening on the street in Lawrence. Did they get arrested? What for? So when I see a newspaper article or I hear county commissioners saying we don't have people in jail for marijuana in this town, that's just simply not accurate. And I think that the public being made aware of what those numbers really look like, I think the public here would be really horrified. So that leads me to why I'm running for Attorney General. I have spent 17 years fighting with every ounce of strength that I've had to save my clients from the machine that is the criminal justice system, because it never stops. There's a conveyor belt going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and there's little children on that conveyor belt, and there's adults. And every single one of those people that doesn't have an attorney standing next to them that is willing to fight for them, which is unfortunately the exception and not the rule in this country in 2018, there is no other choice. You either somehow have someone that can pluck you off of that conveyor belt, or you get fed into the pipeline to prison. And if you're a young black kid in Chicago, it might start at 6 when you get expelled from school. And if you're, a KU student, it might not start until 20 when you get pulled over and the officer says he smells marijuana and he searches your car and finds a gram of marijuana and 1 Adderall pill that's not yours. And now you're charged with a felony and a misdemeanor. You're looking at jail time, you're looking at losing your job, you're looking at losing your financial aid for your schooling. None of those are minor consequences. And we have to, eventually, after fighting against the jail expansion here in Lawrence and going out into the community and just talking to people about criminal justice issues, I felt very strongly that there was a need for this conversation to happen, whether I would get any sort of political support for it or not. Fortunately, as a criminal defense attorney, when every day you're going into court and you're defending people that most people would rather just forget about or pretend don't exist. But the person that advocates for those people is often not someone that is particularly at the top of the list for receiving Christmas cards, right? So to be a defense attorney that now is willing to step up to the plate, put my name on the ballot and say, we're never going to get change in Topeka until we start electing people to go to Topeka that aren't just here to maintain the same narratives, to put money in their friends' pockets, to just continue pushing forward with failed policies no matter the amount of evidence that exists that shows them to be failures. Nothing is ever going to change in the state of Kansas, and I would like to hope, after what we've witnessed on the political stage, that everyone is very aware of what's at stake on November 6th. All that I have to do is look at my daughter and think about what I want the world to be like for her, and the fact that I don't want her to have any barriers to success. But you know what? I wouldn't want that any less if Bridget and I lived in a one-bedroom home and I was working as a waitress at Denny's. You know, we seem to have a culture in politics, a culture of cruelty. Who can be the most cruel? Who can take away the most things from the most vulnerable in society? And someone who has come from a background of being the vulnerable one in society means that I will always be there to fight for those people first, because they need it the most, and they have the fewest people fighting for them. So, please get out and vote on November 6th. Vote for every Democrat on the ballot is what I would say. We've got to take Kansas in a new direction, and Chris Kobach is a nightmare. So please, whatever happens, I hope that we can move in a direction other than that. I don't have anything else. Thank you guys for coming out. If anybody has any questions, Neil and I will be happy to take those.